So I was a young diplomat at that time. I was in the middle of my second posting overseas, and I was living in Zimbabwe, but I'd actually just returned to the United States for some consultations and training, and I'd been back about a week or 10 days in Washington. And then I left Washington on September 10th to see my family. So I was in Illinois, in the middle of the country, and I was drinking a coffee with my mother, and she called me to the television where she was watching the morning program and said, "Heather, there's an accident. There's a terrible accident. An airplane has flown into the World Trade Center." And so we began watching it live on the morning programs on network television. And what we thought within minutes, then we realized it was not a tragic accident, but on the contrary, that it was an act of terrorism. And it just became more surreal as the day went on, watching eventually the plane go into the Pentagon in Washington, where I had just been, driving past it, near it, the day before. I had friends that worked in the Pentagon. I was very worried for their safety. So yeah, it was an odd sensation to be a diplomat, but to be home in the United States and watch the terror unfold.
As a young diplomat then, what came to your mind when you look at, the tragedy, but also in terms of the world in general?
Yeah, I think one of my first thoughts was to the tragedy that we'd experienced just 3 years earlier in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, thinking about the terror attack that in the early months of my diplomatic career had killed so many, including my colleagues and so many Kenyan and Tanzanian partners, and recognizing that the world was changing in some substantial way, that none of us were safe, whether we were in Africa, whether we were in New York, whether we were in Pennsylvania. We were all together in this very challenging circumstance of global terrorism. And I think the other takeaway I have from that time, though, is one of unity. I remember how the world came together in sort of opposition to those acts of terror. I remember the condolences we received as a nation and as individuals from our friends and partners around the world, including in Harare when I was able to return some weeks later, when air flights resumed, which took, as you remember, I think over 10 days, maybe 2 weeks for international flights to resume from the United States. But the ability to sort of see and hear from friends here on the continent just how moved I think everyone was by that loss of life. Nearly 3,000 people from 76 nations, 2 individuals from here in South Africa. We want to pay homage to them and to the first responders who so valiantly tried to save lives at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and some of whom paid the ultimate sacrifice for trying to save lives.
Did the international community do enough in terms of anticipating this tragedy?
Not sure that there's ever an answer to enough. There's always a balance about security and rights and freedoms. We certainly saw changes in global aviation and global security cooperation after that time. Now many of us who know I'm going to call it an inconvenience of going through metal detectors, giving up our water bottles, some of the procedures we go through at airports around the world are in response to those acts of terror. And I think we go through those minor inconveniences together for making the world a safer place. I think we've also been able to create coalitions, including with partners around the world, to try to share information more readily when there are threats, to be sure that we're working together on transnational organized crime and terror cases with our partners, including in South Africa, to keep our citizens safe here and around the world. So I think the positive are the coalitions that we've built, diplomatic and military coalitions at different times, and the law enforcement cooperation that's resulted, the increased sharing of information within my own government and from my government to our partner nations around the world.
How do we ensure that this doesn't happen again?
Well, I think we recommit ourselves to partnership. We find ways to continue interoperability of systems, sharing of data when there are risks, and we hold accountable those who would shelter terrorists. We expect governments to control their territory and not to allow terrorists to exploit any country as a safe haven, the way that at that time Al-Qaeda was exploiting Afghanistan as a base of operations. And I think that is key. I mean, we're certainly concerned seeing unrest growing in this region, and the SADC region's response trying to ensure greater peace, greater stability in Mozambique, just as another example. Those coalitions and that kind of partnership across borders within regional organizations like SADC or the African Union or the United Nations are really key, I think, to keeping us all safer in the future.
You spoke about the developments in Mozambique, and that speaks to those challenges are still there. And the world is more divided. How do we return to multilateralism and, you know, that spirit of oneness in terms of addressing these challenges without suspicion?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to recognize that the underlying causes of unrest and unhappiness are multifaceted. Certainly looking at examples in Afghanistan and in Mozambique, we have to look at the role of development and underdevelopment. We are working together as the United States with many, many partner nations to address humanitarian needs, economic development, recognition of human rights for women and girls, whether it's in northern Mozambique or in Afghanistan. So I think fundamentally we need to address some of those root causes that cause us to be divided, and groups to gain followers who are people who might otherwise just be disgruntled with their lot in life. It's really important that we leave no one behind, and that we create jobs and we create economic opportunities and educational opportunities. And we try to prevent things that could start as criminal from metastasizing into the cancer of terrorism or transnational organized crime. So I think that's something we work on together as leaders in South Africa and the United States, and through the United Nations system, through regional groupings like SADC and the AU.
The world in general, did we learn from the 9/11 incident or that tragedy?
I certainly hope that we did. I think we've learned about what we can do together, and I think we've learned lessons about our common humanity. I think when I reflect on September 11th, again, the international nature of the victims, you know, New York City and the World Trade Center in particular was a center of global commerce. 76 nations among those who lost lives, including 2 South Africans. And in that immediate aftermath, there was such a sense of shared solidarity and shared pain and shared future. I'd like us to reflect on that at this moment, 20 years later, to think about the spirit that South Africa embodies of Ubuntu, of I am because we are, and trying to feel that not just within our boundaries across ethnicities or national groups, but across nations. I think that's something I've learned from South Africa, and I hope I can help to export to the rest of the world.
20 years down the line, Afghanistan, it looks like we are regressing.
Well, I think it's a particularly poignant moment. I think it's a difficult time for Americans watching some of what's unfolded in Afghanistan in recent weeks and the fall of the Afghan government. But 20 years after 9/11, there is no longer a U.S. military presence in Afghanistan, but our diplomatic and our development efforts, our humanitarian concerns, our human rights interests in Afghanistan continue. As President Biden has said recently, we will absolutely hold the Taliban to live up to their words. There have been promises made about respect for fundamental universal human rights, freedom of movement, and other respect for international norms. And I think now the proof is in the actions. And so we're looking to see the Taliban live up to those promises. But at the same time, we haven't given up hope. We remain committed to the people of Afghanistan, through our diplomatic channels, through our development channels, through our work with the United Nations and other bodies. There's more than one way to address the needs of the people of Afghanistan. And so we continue. We also continue to work through negotiations on allowing American citizens, citizens of other nations, and those who worked closely with us who wish to depart through orderly means. I was heartened to see the first charter flight depart Kabul yesterday since the military departed and land in Qatar, and to have that partnership with the government of Qatar really moving some of those individuals out. But fundamentally, we have to care about those on the ground, and especially the women and the girls, and their access to education and to fundamental universal human rights. So I think the United States will work with South Africa, with other partners, with the United Nations, through our diplomatic and other channels to try to secure a peaceful, prosperous, and secure Afghanistan for the future that can be a part of the trade system, can be part of the world.
Some people are saying that when there's tension around the world, people resort to using the military to resolve the problems that we have around the world. What is your response to that?
I mean, I would just argue, Sophie, that I don't think we resorted to war in Afghanistan. I think the United States first tried to give the Taliban the opportunity to surrender Osama bin Laden and the Taliban, and to stop allowing Afghanistan to be a safe haven for global terrorism. When international diplomatic pressure did not result in an effect, then we built a coalition that extended beyond the United States, and I think the military was not our first option. It was an unfortunate tragedy to have to go in and to have, I think war in any case is a tragedy. It's the failure of diplomacy when we have to resort to armed conflict. So I think we need to continue to strengthen and build institutions that can help us to avoid war whenever possible, but to also be ready that if that is the only way forward, just as armed struggle was the only way forward in some cases with revolutions, the American Revolution, there was armed struggle in South Africa to end apartheid. It's our last resort. It is not our choice, but we want to be in a place where we avoid it whenever possible, and we follow humanitarian laws and the laws of war when we're in that conflict. So I think strengthening the UN, strengthening regional organizations like the African Union, strengthening organizations like SADC and the regional economic communities here on the continent is key. I also think peacekeeping operations, peace-building operations need to be an important part of what our militaries are prepared to do and trained to do. We have to continue to watch the potential for conflict in so many nations and hope that we are able to resolve it through diplomacy, but to build the strength of diplomacy, of development, of other options to motivate people to come together and resolve conflict through means other than war.
International editor, SABC's international editor, Sophie Mokoena, in conversation there.